uncle always used to say that his house was haunted. Now, he wasn't the kind of guy to try and mess with you or freak you out. He was very matter-of-fact about recounting his paranormal experiences. Somehow that actually made his stories more scary. The more dry his delivery, the more I believed him. Let's call him Uncle Mark. When I was a kid, my parents and I would go visit him in the summer down in Georgia. He lived in a big old house, which was, and I'm not making this up, down the street from an equally old cemetery. One side of the house was completely covered in ivy, which had begun to grow around to the other sides. The house was maybe 50 feet back from the road, with the main entrance facing it. Uncle Mark didn't really use the main entrance, though. A long driveway ran from the street around to the side of the house, where there was a side door. He would always park his truck by that side door. In addition to Uncle Mark, my dad's brother, my dad's sister, Aunt Kathy, also lived nearby with her family, maybe a 15-minute drive from Uncle Mark's. But when we go down and visit, we'd usually stay with Uncle Mark, since he lived alone, and his big, spooky old house had plenty of room. Even when I was just a kid, he knew I was fascinated and terrified by his stories. Mostly they involved him hearing unexplained sounds. Uncle Mark lived alone, but he would often hear footsteps coming from the floor above him. On one occasion, when he'd run upstairs to check them out, he heard a door close when he reached the top step. One story in particular always stuck with me. One time, my uncle needed to leave town for about a week, traveling for work, and he asked a neighbor to tend to his garden while he was gone. The neighbor agreed. When my uncle returned, he went over to the neighbor's house to thank him by bringing over a nice bottle of wine. The neighbor, however, refused the gift, admitting that he had only tended to the garden for 2 days before finding someone else to fill in for him. When my uncle asked why, the neighbor was a bit hesitant at first, but eventually admitted that he believed he had seen a ghost. On the second day, the neighbor had been over at my uncle's watering the plants when he had happened to glance up at the house. In a window on the second floor, he had seen what looked like an old woman. She was standing there, perfectly still, staring out with milky white eyes. The neighbor only saw her for a moment before she suddenly disappeared. He dropped the watering can, ran, and never returned. A week later, my uncle had hosted a barbecue and invited the whole street. That neighbor declined the invitation, refusing to set foot on the property. Now, as many stories that I'd heard, I'd never actually experienced anything myself. Whenever my family visited, though, I'd be on pins and needles. I'd lie awake at night in the guest bedroom, anxiously anticipating anything out of the ordinary. But I never heard so much as a creak. However, one summer, that all changed. This particular night, we were actually all visiting Aunt Kathy's. Uncle Mark had driven my parents and me over in his truck, and we'd grilled some hot dogs and hamburgers outside. They had a little pool in their backyard, which was an absolute luxury on those hot summer nights. My cousin and I played Marco Polo while the adults made cocktails and relaxed. Eventually it got late enough that it was time to head back. Uncle Mark got his truck started, and my parents hopped in. "Come on, time to go." One of my cousins, Jason, was older than me, and he had just gotten his driver's license. Excited to show off his newfound freedom, Jason offered to drive me over. Uncle Mark and my parents hit the road, and Jason and I left just a minute or two after. Instead of following them, though, Jason decided it would be fun to try and beat them to the house. He knew a back route, which he guaranteed would get us there first. He took us on this shortcut, probably driving a little faster than he should have been. Eventually, we turned onto my uncle's street, passing the old cemetery and coming up on his house. I remember Jason was the first to see it. "Aw, damn," he said. "They beat us. How'd they get here first?" As we approached the house, we could both see someone in the window on the ground floor. There were these big windows on either side of the front door, and even though it was now dark out, we could plain as day see someone standing in one of them. Someone was home. We'd lost the race. As we got closer to the house, Jason slowed down and turned into the driveway. We passed the front side of the house, and I got a better look in the window and realized that the person in it wasn't my uncle or my parents. In fact, I didn't recognize them at all. It looked like a very old woman. She had white hair and that sort of curly hairstyle that old women have, and was wearing a light-colored nightgown. I watched her as we passed by the window, but she was just staring off into the distance with milky white eyes. "Wait, nobody's home?" Jason sounded confused. As he pulled into the driveway, we saw that it was empty. My uncle's truck was nowhere to be seen. If we had beaten them after all, then who could that be inside? Jason parked and got out, going to knock on the side door. After a few minutes, with no response, he looked back at me, and I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. We had seen the ghost. I got out of the car too, and we walked around to the front of the house. The window she had been standing in was now empty. We looked in through the old glass, but the house was dark inside. Beep, beep. Jason and I jumped as Uncle Mark's truck came around the corner. He pulled into the driveway, and we recounted our experience to him and my parents. My parents seemed somewhat spooked, but my uncle wasn't too alarmed, and just said, "Yep, sounds like that was a ghost." He went inside, turning on the lights and looking around. No sign of the ghost. We all followed him, thoroughly creeped out. I remember refusing to sleep at my uncle's house that night, and Jason driving me back to Aunt Kathy's instead. My uncle still lives in that house, actually, and every so often I'll hear another story about one of his strange experiences. The spirit doesn't seem to be evil or malicious in any way, so he's just learned to live with it. What I live with, on the other hand, is the indelible image of that woman on the other side of the glass, and a now firm belief in the unexplainable. What an encounter. Have you ever seen something that turned you into a believer? Do feel free to leave a comment below.